They say that when you move into a place where the previous tenant left in a hurry, you shouldn't ask why. You should just enjoy the low rent and the fresh coat of paint that hides the history of the walls. I didn't ask. I was 24, working a dead-end data entry job, and I needed a win. The apartment was a third-floor walk-up in a building that smelled like old cedar and damp wool. It was perfect for a man who wanted to be invisible. But the silence in that apartment wasn't normal. It wasn't the absence of sound. It was a weight. It felt like the air was holding its breath, waiting for me to do something worth noticing. The first week was fine. Then the scratching started. It wasn't behind the walls like a rodent. It sounded like it was coming from the middle of the room, right at the foot of my bed. I'd wake up in the dead of night, heart hammering against my ribs, staring into the pitch-black corner of the room, convinced that if I blinked, the shadows would shift. I bought the recorder on a whim. It was a high-end digital device, sensitive enough to pick up a spider crawling on a curtain. I told myself it was for peace of mind. I'd record the night, hear nothing but my own snoring, and finally be able to sleep without the light on. Test 1. I whispered into the mic that first night. My voice sounded small, alien in the hollow room. I set it on the nightstand and closed my eyes. The next morning, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee, the sun streaming through the grime-streaked window. I plugged the headphones in and hit play. For the first 3 hours, there was nothing. The rhythmic rise and fall of my breathing. The occasional distant hum of a car outside. Then, at 3:14 a.m., the sound of my breathing changed. It became sharp, erratic. I was having a nightmare. And then I heard it. Click. It was the distinct sound of someone or something stepping onto the hardwood floor. Slow. Deliberate. The floorboards didn't just creak. They groaned under a weight that shouldn't have been there. I stopped breathing, my hand hovering over the pause button. On the recording, the footsteps stopped right next to my bed. There was a long silence, perhaps a full minute, where the only sound was my panicked, sleeping gasps. Then, a voice. It wasn't a whisper. It was a rasp, like dry leaves being dragged across a tombstone. Not yet, it said. I dropped the headphones. The coffee in my hand was cold. I looked at the spot on the floor where the sound had come from. The sunlight made the wood look harmless, but I knew what I'd heard. I wasn't alone. I spent the rest of the day in a daze. I tried to tell myself it was a prank, or maybe I was talking in my sleep in a voice I didn't recognize. But the weight of the footsteps. You can't faking the way a building reacts to mass. That night, I didn't want to sleep. I sat on the sofa with a kitchen knife in my lap, staring at the bedroom door. But exhaustion is a predator. It waits for your eyes to get heavy, for your resolve to crumble. Around 2 a.m., I drifted off. When I woke up, the recorder was missing from the nightstand. I found it in the bathroom, sitting on the edge of the sink. I hadn't gone to the bathroom in the night. I would have remembered. My heart felt like a trapped bird as I pressed play on the new file. The recording started with the sound of me dragging the device across the floor. But the rhythm was wrong. It was jerky. Then the sound of water running. A splash. And then the voice again, closer this time, right against the microphone. Julian, it whispered. It knew my name. Julian. Look under the sink. I didn't want to look. Every instinct I had, honed by a lifetime of horror movies and common sense, told me to run out the front door and never look back. But curiosity is a different kind of curse. I knelt on the cold tile and opened the cabinet doors. Behind the pipes, tucked into a corner, was a small, leather-bound journal. The pages were yellowed, the ink faded. It belonged to the man who lived here before me. I spent the next 6 hours reading. He'd done the same thing. He'd recorded the room. He'd heard the voice. But his entries grew more erratic toward the end. He wrote about the balance. He wrote about how the voice wasn't an intruder, but a reflection. It only says what you're thinking, the last entry read. It only does what you're afraid of. I looked in the mirror. My eyes were bloodshot, my skin pale. I didn't look like myself. I looked like a man who was being hollowed out from the inside. Are you there? I whispered to the empty bathroom. The recorder in my hand vibrated. I hadn't pressed record, but the red light was pulsing. I am here, Julian. The voice didn't come from the air. Came from the device. But I wasn't wearing headphones. The sound was vibrating through the plastic, through my skin, directly into my bones. What do you want? I asked, my voice trembling. I want you to remember what you did at the old house. I froze. No one knew about the old house. No one knew about the fire, or the reason I'd moved 3 states away and changed my life. I'd buried that memory under a mountain of mundane days and sleepless nights. You think paint hides the history, Julian? The voice hissed. It only seals it in. I felt a sudden, sharp pain in my ankle, like something had bitten me. I looked down. There was nothing there, but the skin was turning a bruised, angry purple. I realized then that this wasn't just a haunting. It was an interrogation, and I was the only witness. I didn't sleep for 48 hours. Every time my eyelids grew heavy, I would hear that rhythmic, wet scratching coming from the foot of the bed. It wasn't just a sound anymore. It was a physical sensation, a vibration that traveled through the floorboards and up into the soles of my feet. The journal I found under the sink sat open on the kitchen table. I had read it until the words blurred into meaningless ink blots. The previous tenant, a man named Marcus, had documented a slow descent into a very specific kind of madness. He didn't believe the apartment was haunted by a ghost. He believed the apartment was a receiver, a place where the frequency of reality was thin enough to pick up the broadcasts of our own subconscious. It hears what you hide, Marcus had written in a shaky hand. And once it hears it, it gives it a mouth. I looked at the digital recorder. The red light was still on, even though I hadn't touched it. The storage indicator showed that it was nearly full. Hours and hours of silence that I knew, deep down, weren't silent at all. I put the headphones on. My hands were shaking so violently I nearly dropped them. I hit play on the most recent file. At first, it was just the ambient hum of the room. But then I heard my own voice. Not the voice from part 1, but a recording of me talking to myself from earlier that afternoon. I need to leave. I need to pack a bag and just drive, my recorded self said. Then the response. It was the rasping voice again, but it was shifting. It was beginning to sound more like me. You can't drive away from a fire you're still carrying, Julian. The smoke is in your lungs. It's in this room. I felt a cold sweat break out across my forehead. How do you know about the fire? I whispered to the empty kitchen. The recorder chirped. A new file had been created instantly. Played it. Because you remember the smell of the curtains catching. The voice, my voice, but twisted, replied. You remember how the door handle was too hot to touch. You remember the sound of your brother screaming on the other side of that wood, and how you didn't reach for the handle. You reached for your car keys. The room seemed to tilt. The walls, which I thought were solid, felt like they were pulsing. The memory I had tried so hard to kill was being resurrected by a piece of plastic and some silicon chips. 10 years ago, a small house in the suburbs, a faulty space heater and a moment of pure, blinding cowardice. I had told everyone it was an accident, that I was already outside when the flames took the hallway. But the voice knew. The room knew. Stop it, I sobbed, clutching the recorder. It's over. He's gone. Is he? The sound didn't come from the recorder this time. Came from the bedroom. I stood up, the chair screeching against the floor. I walked toward the bedroom door, my heart a frantic drum in my chest. The air grew colder with every step. When I pushed the door open, the room was empty, but the bed sheets were ruffled as if someone had just climbed out of them. And there, on the floor, were wet footprints. Not water, something thicker, darker, smelling of ash and scorched earth. The footprints led from the bed to the closet. I approached the closet door, my hand hovering over the knob. I could hear something inside. It was a low, rhythmic sound. Thump, 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 like a head being hit against a wall. I pulled the door open. There was no one there, only my hanging shirts and a stack of boxes. But on the back wall of the closet, written in what looked like soot, were the words, "Record the closet." I felt a wave of nausea. I didn't want to do it. I wanted to burn the building down just like the house. but I was trapped in a loop of my own making. I placed the recorder on the floor of the closet and closed the door. I sat on the edge of the bed and waited. I didn't have to wait long. Through the thin wood of the closet door, I heard the recorder click on. Then, a sound that made my blood turn to ice. It was the sound of a child laughing. A soft, bubbling laugh that I hadn't heard in a decade. "Julian?" the child's voice asked. "Is it dark in there, too?" I lunged for the door and ripped it open. The closet was empty. The recorder was gone. I spun around, looking for where it could have gone, when I heard a muffled sound coming from inside the mattress. I grabbed the kitchen knife I'd left on the nightstand and began to hack at the fabric. I ripped through the foam and the springs, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Deep inside the padding, nestled among the metal coils, was the recorder. It was hot to the touch. I pressed play. There was no voice this time, just the sound of a fire, the roar of flames, the cracking of timber, and the sound of a small hand scratching against a wooden door. Scritch, 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 and then a new sound, the sound of someone, me, breathing outside that door. Heavy, panicked breathing. "I'm sorry," my recorded voice whispered from 10 years ago. The recording didn't end. It looped. Scritch, scritch. "I'm sorry." Scritch, scritch. "I'm sorry." Suddenly, the lights in the apartment flickered and died. The only light came from the small, red glowing LED of the recorder. I looked down at my hands. They weren't covered in mattress foam. They were covered in soot. I looked at the walls. The fresh paint was peeling away in long, blackened strips, revealing charred wood underneath. The apartment wasn't just a receiver. It was a mirror, and it was showing me exactly what I was. I heard the front door of the apartment open and then click shut. Click. Footsteps. Slow, heavy footsteps walking down the hallway toward the bedroom. But they didn't sound like a man's footsteps. They sounded like someone dragging a heavy, limp weight behind them. I backed into the corner, the knife held out in front of me. "Who's there?" The footsteps stopped right outside the bedroom door. "Julian," the voice said. It was no longer a rasp. It was perfectly clear. It was the voice of my brother, the way he sounded before the smoke took his lungs. "You forgot to record the ending." The door handle began to turn. The bedroom door didn't just open. It disintegrated. The wood didn't splinter. It turned to ash and blew away into a room that was no longer my apartment. I was standing in a corridor of scorched timber and hanging, blackened drywall. The smell was unbearable. The metallic tang of blood mixed with the suffocating stench of a house that had been dead for a decade. "Julian," the voice called again. It was closer, just beyond the veil of smoke that now filled the hallway. I looked down at the recorder in my hand. The plastic was melting, sticking to my palm like hot wax. The red light was no longer blinking. It was a solid, angry beam of crimson that cut through the haze. "Play me," the device seemed to whisper. I pressed the button. The recording didn't start with my voice or my brother's. It started with a sound I'd never heard before, the sound of a heart stopping. A long, flat tone that vibrated in my teeth. Then, a heavy, rhythmic breathing that I realized was my own, but it wasn't coming from the past. It was perfectly synced with my chest right now. I looked up. Emerging from the smoke was a figure. He was small, his clothes charred and clinging to a frame that was far too thin. His face was a map of ruin, but his eyes were mine. "You didn't just leave me, Julian," the boy said. His voice echoed through the recorder and the room simultaneously. "You recorded it. Don't you remember?" My mind fractured. The memory I had suppressed didn't just come back. It reframed itself. I hadn't just reached for my keys. I had been holding my phone. I had been so paralyzed by the horror, so detached from reality, that I had hit record on a voice memo app as the flames took the house. I wanted to capture the moment of my own tragedy so I could feel like a victim later. I had listened to his last moments for years until the guilt forced me to delete the file and bury the memory. But the apartment hadn't forgotten. The recorder hadn't forgotten. "I'm sorry," I whispered, the words tasting like soot. I was a kid. I was scared. You weren't scared, the figure said, stepping into the red light of the recorder. You were a witness. And a witness is just a killer who doesn't want to get their hands dirty. The boy reached out. His hand was cold, colder than the winter air outside. He didn't grab my throat. He grabbed the recorder. It's time for the response, he said. He pressed a button I didn't know the device had. The red light turned white, blindingly bright. The sound that erupted from the speakers wasn't a voice. It was a vacuum, a great roaring hole in the air that began to suck the room into itself. The charred walls, the smoke, the memories, all of it began to spiral into the tiny digital device. I felt my skin begin to pull, my very thoughts being dragged out of my skull. I tried to scream, but the sound was caught by the recorder before it could even leave my throat. Wait, I gasped. The world went black. I woke up on the floor of my apartment. The sun was shining. The smell of cedar and damp wool was back. The walls were covered in fresh, white paint. There were no footprints, no charred wood. I sat up, my head throbbing. It was a dream. It had to be. A vivid, guilt-induced hallucination brought on by the stress of the move and the silence of the building. I looked at the nightstand. The recorder was there. It looked brand new. No melted plastic. No soot. I laughed. A shaky, hysterical sound. Just a dream, I muttered. I picked up the recorder to turn it off, to throw it in the trash and never think about it again. But I noticed the storage bar. It was full. I hit play, expecting to hear nothing. The recording started with the sound of a door opening. Then, the sound of someone walking into the room. Julian, a voice said on the tape. It was my voice. Exactly my voice. I'm here, another voice responded. It was also my voice. I listened, frozen, as the two voices on the tape began to talk. They discussed the weather, the move, the low rent. They sounded happy. They sounded like a man talking to his roommate. Then the first voice said, "He's waking up." The second voice replied, "Good. I'm tired of being the one on the outside." I looked at my hands. They were pale. Too pale. I looked in the mirror above the dresser, but I didn't see my reflection. I saw the bedroom behind me. I saw the bed, the nightstand, and the recorder. But I wasn't in the mirror. I looked down at the recorder again. A new file was being created. Recording. I tried to move, but my body felt like it was made of heavy glass. I watched as the door to the bedroom opened. A man walked in. He looked exactly like me. He wore my clothes. He had my messy hair. He looked at the bed, then looked directly at the spot where I was standing, or where I thought I was standing. He didn't see me. He walked right through me, feeling like a gust of warm air. He picked up the recorder. He looked at the screen and smiled. It was a smile I had never made, one full of a dark, predatory satisfaction. "Test one," he whispered into the mic. He set the recorder down and laid on the bed, closing his eyes. I reached out to touch him, to scream, to reclaim my life, but my hand passed through his chest like smoke. I wasn't the man in the room anymore. I was the sound in the walls. I was the weight in the air. I was the silence that was waiting to be recorded. The red light on the recorder blinked. Once, twice, and then, from the depths of the device, from the place where I now lived, I heard myself whisper the only thing I had left to say. Not yet. If you love this story and want more contents like this, comment, like, and subscribe to the channel. Also, check out the channel for interesting videos.